Hi, welcome to the bathtub. This is the old masturbator and the old masturbator's dog, Lucky. Lucky has come back. No, she's going away. You can get down now. That's fine. She hears the beeping of the camera starting, and now she wants to come up here. She's coming back to the show. Exciting. Special guest star. We're doing our normal post tech decade. We're no pixels, crew light a day. We're doing everything without a boom camera. You used to have the boom mic and the rotating cameras and all the special effects. Pure reading, pure bathtub reading. It's all we do anymore because we're pioneering the post-tech decade. Today we're going to talk about a writer who I've had mixed feelings about over the years, but we have many of our bathing buddies have written in about how much they like this guy, and he's kind of seems to be developing over the years a fairly firm trajectory into being better read than he was when he was writing. That's Gene Wolfe. This is Gene Wolfe's, I want to say it's his third novel, but I'm not entirely certain. People sometimes like to write and correct me and say how stupid I am, and they're right. I don't check many of my facts, but I'm pretty sure it's roughly his third novel, and maybe his second science fiction novel. And it had a curious history. The fifth head of Cerberus, the fifth head of Cerberus, which is, I think, the three-headed dog. Again, there's another thing I can't remember because I'm old. It guarded hell, I think. I think it guarded Hades with Cerberus, and I forget. But that's the book we're going to talk about. We'll talk a little bit about Gene Wolfe. Many of our bathing buddies have written in and said they really quite like him. And the book that he's best known for is the Earth of the New Sun. Is that what that's? The Book of the New Sun. The Book of the New Sun, which is 4 volumes. The first one is called The Shadow of the Torturer. As one of our bathing buddies and I were in a little exchange a while back, this was originally written as a single novel, a fairly long 800-page novel, and the editor, David Hartwell, and this is the story. I got this from John Clute. He's one of the few authorities. He definitely gets his facts right, especially on Gene Wolfe, who he loves. This was originally one novel. It reads as a novel, but they chopped it up into four parts because they wanted to turn it into everything. A trilogy or a series at that time was about all any people would buy. They also tried to do this with the famous, it was a disaster, with the great John Slottick. They took his hilarious novel Roderick and they chopped it. They tried to chop it up into a trilogy, and they only published the first book, and it was a disaster. Wonderful writer, John Slottick. Total digression. This is the one he's best known for. It's 4 volumes. If you read it, you can't really read the first volume. You really have to read all 4. And I had mixed feelings about it. I know this is a really brilliant piece of SF fantasy. It's pure science fantasy, far future, really mind-bending, poetic imagery, poetic plotting. He has a really complicated and beautiful sense of plot and complications. And I've never made it past volume 2. That's the story. I've tried it 3 or 4 times, and I've enjoyed it. And I've always kind of fell off the boat about the end of volume 2 or beginning of volume 3. But I want to try it again. You really need to be paying attention when you read this book. Okay, so that's one of my failures. I'll be hearing from people. I would also say that there's a couple of writers who, whatever I say about them, I get a bunch of idiots who write me and say, you got this wrong about page 2, and you didn't pronounce his name right. Nabokov is one of them. People who like Nabokov are just idiots. They just write just idiotic emails to me constantly about how I make mistakes. I could give a fuck. It's my bathtub. I'm going to read it. I'm going to make all the mistakes I want. And the same with Gene Wolfe. I think there's a lot of people who they're puritists. You have to know exactly what's happening in every single book. And I never know exactly what's happening. I've read Ulysses several times. I still don't know what the hell's happening half the time in some of the chapters. And I don't know what happens in a lot of this book. But it's really an interesting book. And I'm going to make a case for it and against it. So the first thing is that the fifth head of Cerberus was originally a novella about 70 or 80 pages. And it was published in a series of books that I read. We've talked about on this show. And I read and loved avidly when I was 14, 15 years old. And that's the Orbit series, Damon Knight's brilliant Orbit series, which published all these wonderful writers who were well regarded in the SF field at the time, but are maybe perhaps finally getting some attention outside of the SF field. R.A. Lafferty was always in one of these. Kate Wilhelm, the great Kate Wilhelm we've talked about, Joanna Russ, and Carol Emshwiller, another interesting short story writer, and Gene Wolfe. Gene Wolfe was in almost every volume of Orbit. And in Orbit 10, he published a novella called The Fifth Head of Cerberus. It was originally a novella. There's a beginning, middle, and end. It's a pretty interesting and complicated story. I just read it for maybe the third time this past week when I was reading the whole book. And it's hard to describe in certain ways because it doesn't summarize too well. It's a pleasure to read. It's about a kid growing up. It's a coming-of-age story about a kid growing up on some faraway planet. As I recall, there's two different suns. There's two different planets, and they're neighboring one another, and they've been settled by Earth, who knows how far back in the past. And this kid is growing up in this house where the father is off in some distant room, and there's glimpses of the outer world of this house. This kid raises, he's obviously wealthy, and he lives with someone he thinks is his brother, another person he thinks is his aunt. It almost sounds a little bit, when you read it, a little bit like we talked about Gormenghast and the Titus Groan books. It almost sounds like that kind of immensity of this house. And he gets outside into the world. And when he goes outside of the world, there's slavery on this planet, and many of the slaves look like the kid. He notices he looks like him. And as the book develops, he's going into to see his father, and his father is giving him some sort of mental test. Now, one of the things interesting about Wolfe is he never tells you what's happening, but he does. It's very modernist in that Joycean way, where you really aren't being explained what's happening. You're sort of going through the experiences with the protagonist and through their point of view. And so you're going up into this room and you're going through these long, complicated psychological testing every night, which you don't quite understand. Just as you don't understand why so many of these people look like this kid or somebody, I think is there a dog that shows up that looks like this kid. So as he grows up, he comes of age and all these things happen to him. I don't want to tell the whole plot, but along the way we learn that there's a man named John Marsh comes to visit the house, and he comes to visit the house to meet some famous anthropologist who the kid thinks is his dad. And the kid, that John Marsh wants to come because this anthropologist has written a book saying that the people on this planet are not from Earth. They were originally it was populated by shapeshifters, creatures that could change from one shape into another, and the Earth people came and landed, and these shapeshifters imitated them so well that they could actually imitate the memories on these people. And they are who populates this planet. That's sort of roughly the argument of this book. And he goes off. It turns out it's his aunt. It's not the father. It's the aunt who's written this book. Now, Wolfe never ties anything up. It's another modernist aspect of the book. He never actually tells you whether, particularly in the first novella, whether these really are Earthlings settling this planet, or they're actually from this other. They're these shapeshifters who have inherited and all the characteristics and memories of these Earthlings. And the story goes on. I don't want to say any more than that, except that it's a really haunting, involving story. Wolfe has the ability to write about these kind of far future landscapes, which is what makes the Book of the No Sun so interesting. He reminds me a lot of a writer I loved as a kid, Jack Vance. I think I've mentioned them together. Here's two I remember a lot. Big Planet, The Languages of Pow. I read these when I was 13, 14. The Dying Earth is the great one by Jack Vance. And he reminds me quite a bit of him, and he's often compared to him. But he has a kind of complication of plot and a complication of presentation, though you never really quite know what's going on, and you have to puzzle it out. When that novella came out, it got pretty good attention, as many of the stuff in Orbit did. And Gene Wolfe, after writing the novella, which is itself a self-contained novella, he was commissioned by an editor to turn it into a novel. Now, that's what often happened in science fiction, and particularly in science fiction, because people would have a popular story or a popular novel, and some publisher would say, well, write sequels to it or expand it. Often they would expand the novel, and it would just fall apart. I can't think about examples offhand, but they would just get too long, and they would be expanded to the point where they just lost all the original beauty of them. What Wolfe tries to do with his book is he writes two subsequent stories set in the same world. They are two really, really strange shifts from the first story. The second story is when I've read it. I've read this book twice now. The first time I didn't really like it too much, but I found I knew there was a lot of intelligence in it, but I had trouble understanding it when I was 14 or 15. Even now, having paid a little closer attention to it, I still find it a little frustrating to read. The second novella is basically a story told by this man John Marsh about. Let me show you his name right. John Marsh. Yeah, John V. Marsh. That is tells the story of one of these shapeshifters on this planet and what they were like. And it's kind of clear they can turn into sort of like tree-like creatures. And it takes us through this kind of long story of this alien who lives on this planet, encountering other aliens and Earthlings, and it's not always clear who's who. And the first 20 pages of the story, I was completely puzzled. Eventually, it makes its own sort of sense, and you can sort of follow it and sort of enjoy it. And at the same time, and at the end, I sort of liked it a little bit better. But it's a hard story to follow, and particularly after the first one, which is a little closer to a conventional narrative, it really does throw you for a bit of a loop. The third section is about this guy who's in prison. He's being interrogated, and he's being interrogated about his relationships and his efforts to go out into the wilderness of this planet and find these original natives, these original creatures, these original inhabitants. In some ways, it really works out. It's an incredibly interesting story when you read all this post-colonial stuff that the universities love to do. I'm sure they would love to do this story, but he is talking about the way people can actually overwrite the history of the culture they inhabit, and how that culture can actually overwrite them in different ways. So it's a very interesting story. It's a complicated story. The manuscript of this man's travels are all broken up, and you have to read through them in fragments as if they were all falling on the floor, and you pick them up. It sometimes lapses into kind of G.K. Chesterton type satire. This kind of threw me for a loop this time, I have to say. There's a section in here where they do a satire on the Department of Parks, and Christmas falls on Saturday. On the Monday follow, there's a whole section in it that sounds a lot like The Man Who Was Thursday. For those who know that book, a lot of kind of comedy about bureaucracies. Anyway, I kind of went in and out of it at the end, but I can see why so many people, including Clute and Tom Dish, my old friend Tom Dish, who really were knocked out by this book. It was such an intelligent and complicated and original book when it came out. For my mind, it suffers from the problem of trying to take a great novella and turn it into a novel. But it is a real challenging read, and definitely worth thinking about if you like science fiction. If you don't like SF, I think it's very much a science fiction novel. It's not like Orwell, a science fiction novel that can be read by people who don't like science fiction. I think you really have to enjoy the genre to enjoy the complications that he performs in that genre. He was a buddy of R.A. Lafferty, the writer we also like here at the Bathtub. A little younger, both Catholic. There's a lot of Catholicism in old Gene Wolfe as there is in Lafferty. I don't know if I can explain why, but it's there. Very, very challenging, very interesting book. I'm kind of glad I got back into it. I'm reading him again. I'm going to show a couple other books real quickly by him. Dodo, shut up. I reread this about 5 years ago. It's his first novel, Operation Aries. Isn't that a beautiful book? A book I read when it came out. I was 13 or 14, 15 when I read most of these books. And I knew his short stories. His short stories are really his best work. This book, I love this book, The Island of Dr. Death and Other Stories. We've talked about that in the past. It's a great book of science fiction stories. Real poetry in them. This was a really strange book the first time I read it, and I didn't understand it. I understand it was cut. According to the SF Encyclopedia, it was cut a lot. A lot of it was cut, and it sometimes feels a little puzzling what's happening. I do like, Dodo, please shut up. I do like the way it jumps from one chapter to another. He'll have end of a chapter. I remember there's one chapter where the guy falls off a roof, and it takes up again like years later, and you kind of catch on to all the political happenings. It's a political novel about an Earth which is being infiltrated by this Martian colony that's coming back. There's a lot of interest in these in cultures inhabiting other cultures and being inhabited by that culture and going back and forth. This kind of cross transference and cross influence of these cultures. And I don't remember, but I read it 4 or 5 years ago, and I did like reading it, but it was a bit puzzling. And then this is maybe his second novel, which I read years ago. And I think it's a historical novel. I can't even remember now. But anyway, I didn't quite get that one. The Devil in the Forest, and I think that it was a young adult novel. Anyway, I was thinking of trying to read my way up and go through try the Book of the New Sun one more time, and maybe we'll do that in the future, a far future episode of reading great books in the bathtub, pure mountain water, unpixelated, unmarinated, happy bathing.